there were two categories of children back in Paris and in France back in the 18th century. There were children of the aristocracy and then all the rest. And interestingly, and it's counterintuitive, all the rest of the children fared better than children of the aristocracy. This according to Olivier Bernier's book, Pleasure and Privilege. Bernier said that working class children, they were expected to fare for themselves, to pay their own way, so they would have to be educated accordingly. And because living space was meager, parents and children tended to live together. They would see one another. This was not true with children of the aristocracy. So, children of the aristocracy, they would be parsed out shortly after they were born. For 3 to 4 years, they would be parsed out to a wet nurse. And there was no licensing agency. I mean, it was not like they were certified. And accidents happened. The story goes that Talleyrand, who became a priest and subsequently the foreign minister of France, that his wet nurse dropped him, left unattended. He developed a clubfoot. Well, clubfoot, he couldn't be in the military, no sparkling appearance at court, so he became a priest. It didn't quite restrict his activities. He did father Eugene Delacroix. Delacroix was the last of the classic grand masters of painting, in the same league with Peter Paul Rubens and Rembrandt, in fact. So 3 to 4 years with a wet nurse, and then back home into the arms of a governess. They might see parents for a few minutes a day, possibly a few minutes a month. And when they were 7 or 8 years of age, usually a tutor would come in to teach them reading, writing. You remember the Abbé Féon, and many of these would be monks and priests who would do this deed. Girls, when they were 9 or 10 years old, would be parsed out to convents. So they would learn singing and dancing and deportment. And then, if things worked out, an arranged marriage, assuming a dowry could be cobbled together. This was the life of children of the aristocracy. But things were changing. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote a book called Émile in 1762, and he argued that raising children ought to be different, that parents should not hover over them, but should let them outside, let them run free. Let them explore for themselves. Let them fall and hurt themselves. They'll figure it out. Let them see parents being patient but disciplined, working, and they will learn. Even before that, John Rollin, in 1726, he wrote a book, The Treatise on Education, addressing education for children of the aristocracy. And he specifically addressed educating children of the nobility because they would be in leadership positions. Those children, those were the leaders for France. You remember France at the time. It had a social caste system, essentially. So the monarchy was in a league by itself. But then there were 3 estates. The population of France at the time was 27.5 million. The first estates were the clergy. About 10% of the clergy were in fact children of nobility who couldn't get a job in the military, they couldn't, no presence at court, and so they were shifted off into clerical responsibilities. That was about 10% of all the clergy. And they comprised, incidentally, of that 27.5 million, about 0.5%, 130,000. 90% of the clergy, though, were low-level, monks and priests, many of them tutors. The second estate, the nobility, and there were 2 categories, and they comprised about 1.5% of the population. First, there was nobility of the sword. These were families that had long pedigree. Those genealogy lists went back hundreds, thousand years, in fact. And they were the ones who were registered. And they wore the epee. They had permission to wear the epee. And you remember the epee, it was the longest and heaviest of the swords. You remember there were three categories of swords: the epee, the foil, and the saber. They would wear the epee. The second category, the nobility of the robe. These were people that paid their way into this estate. They paid their money into the treasury. This was a money-making scheme for the king. So the nobility of the sword and the nobility of the robe, they were at odds with one another. The nobility of the sword, they felt that they had earned their way in. Well, they were born into that estate. The nobility of the robe, well, they felt that they had worked their way in. So there was this contention between the two. But there were distinct advantages to being in this estate. They paid no taxes. Think about that. The corvée, several days that had to be committed to your working on public roads. The nobility didn't have to do that. The taille, the land tax, they didn't have to pay that. And the most hated of them all, because they faced it every day, the salt tax, the gabelle. They paid none of this. Lafayette was in this second estate and the first category, the nobility of the sword. And there was the third estate, that was everybody else. It was 95% of the population. And there were two categories: urban, that included merchants, wage earners, lawyers, and doctors were in that category. And then the rural, that included free peasants and serfs, the villein. They had to get permission to leave the land. So these three estates, this hierarchy. Oh, and incidentally, since that time, there's now the fourth estate, you recall, which has to do with mass media. Edmund Burke really coined that term. And then more of late, the fifth estate. And those are non-traditional media, like bloggers, for instance. So Lafayette was in this second estate, and John Rollin, his book, 1726, Treatise on Education, was addressing the education of these children. And this is what he said in his book. Charles Rollin said, "Virtue alone puts men in a position to fill public office. It's virtue that gives a man the taste for true and solid glory, which inspires in him love of country and the desire to serve it well, which teaches him always to prefer the public good to private goods." So, education for the nobility was specifically directed in this manner.